The Bothy Storytelling Podcast is a member of the Alberta Podcast Network, powered by ATB. Welcome to the Bothy Storytelling Podcast. I'm your host, Callum Lycan. And another podcast. Such a beautiful morning in Calgary. I've been out walking the dog already. He's snoozing in the background, as always now. Seems that I've got a studio dog permanently. But welcome to this podcast. And this one is all about how not to podcast. Yep, it's a year since I started this podcast pretty much. And I've learned a lot. So this is kind of a little guide of my experience and the stuff that probably I've been doing wrong all along. But before we get into that, let's have a word from one of our sponsors, the ATB Arts and Culture branch. It's for creative minds that need creative banking. That's why ATB created the branch for arts and culture, a branch that understands artists don't live by the rules or standard pay schedules. So you can be creative and not have to worry about your checking account. It's a creative space for creative types, and just one more way ATB will always be more than a bank. The Bothy Storytelling Podcast has now been live for a year. I actually published my first episode on the 12th of January last year. So as I record this one on the 14th, basically 2 days after I first launched, a year and 2 days after I first launched, I'm doing the How Not to podcast today. Because, I've not been the best podcaster, folks. I'll admit it. I'm on episode 20. Let me just double check my manual here. 27. Now, I've pulled out my phone because I want to do a wee maths check for you. Because if I had followed my correct schedule and done everything I should have done without completely falling to the wayside, I should be at least on episode, let's just say episode 48 to 50. Yeah, now you're starting to see the problem there. This is why I'm doing the How Not to podcast, because I totally fell off the ball so many times. You guys know this. Anyone that's followed the podcast knows that I have not been consistent. And that is the first golden rule I'm learning of podcasting. You need to be so consistent. You need to constantly be on the ball. A lot of people record in advance. I know a couple of the guys, good friends of mine, Rebel Podcast, Drop Bear and Panda. They've usually got a little bit in the bank. Most of the other guys from the Alberta Podcast Network, they've usually got a few in the bank. Me, I'm a very off-the-cuff person, and I'm recording this episode 27, which is actually late. Great start to the new year. If you listen to my last podcast, I made all these not resolutions, and already falling off them because this is me. Yeah, I was busy last week, to be honest, guys. I was doing a couple of Burns events, public talks, juggling a lot of things. This dog, as I've mentioned before, is really throwing out my schedule. He is adorable. He's gorgeous. He's sound asleep on the floor of the studio, but he's really throwing out my schedule. So, yeah, I'm making excuses. The truth is, it's me. Sometimes I need inspiration to do this. I love doing it, but just sometimes I wake up and I'm just like, I just don't have the heart. And I like to give you guys everything that I can. I want to give you the pizzazz, the razzle dazzle, the Chicago moments, give them the old razzle dazzle, etc., etc. But sometimes I wake up just with it's not in my heart, and I struggle to get it done. So I would rather be a bit more spontaneous and get these out, but I do need to schedule. So the first rule, I think anyone who's looking to start a podcast, because this is kind of the thing that I've been seeing, a lot of podcast groups on Facebook, a lot of sites that I'm a member of, I see a few people, how do you start a podcast? How do you name your podcast? Now, to me, that second question is a bit unusual because you just do. I didn't really come up with anything fancy. The bothy is an old Scottish thing. It's something that's always been in my mind. The bothy is something where, it's the hearth and home thing, and it's where stories are told, where people gather. So it's always been in my head. A lot of people kind of like, I've heard asking, how do you name your podcast? Well, what's your podcast about? It's like, oh, well, my podcast's about football. Well, it's like, okay. Well, there's a couple of obvious ones, but you've got to be smarter. There's a lot of people, sorry, done it again. Soccer. It's about soccer. Yes. Yeah. Football in Scotland. Come on. Yeah. Ball, foot, kick. Yep. Football. But yeah, it's a lot of people kind of struggle to come up with a name or don't have a name. And I always find that a bit strange because your podcast kind of dictates your name. It dictates what you're talking about, what you're doing. Sorry for that pause there, folks. I just had a horrible moment that my second mic was on and I'm looking at my sound bars and going, why am I getting picked up in that second zone? It was just doofus moment. Hey, here's another great point about podcasting, folks. Know your equipment. Know what you're doing. Don't just be a klutz like me who fumbles into it because, it might be fun and it might be an interesting thing to do, but you kind of do need to be semi-professional when you're doing it. At least people are investing time in your podcast. So, hitting the mic stand like it just did again and stuff like that. Some people might not be impressed with that. Me personally, I'm just like, hey, we're all human. Get over it. But yeah, scheduling's a huge thing and it's something that I need to get on top of because I'm really, really not good at it. This podcast should have been out last Wednesday. I'm recording it Monday morning. I've got an interview this Wednesday in the studio with another podcaster, and that'll be coming on the air on Wednesday. Now, has anyone worked out what I'm saying yet? Yeah, that means Wednesday morning I'm interviewing the person for the podcast, which needs to go out on Wednesday. Now, does anybody think that podcast might actually be a bit late? Because I'm thinking it could be as well. My aim is not to, but this week I've got a lot of stuff on. I'll be brutally honest. We're going to see The Officiant for the wedding because it's coming up soon, July. I've left it all this last minute Scottish. We're relaxed. I've got the interview and I'm going out to do a volunteer thing at a radio station to get some more kind of background knowledge. I have a meeting tonight for Tales Storytelling, a rebranding meeting. So there's a lot on this week again. There's a few things I've forgotten about as well. Someone's coming to do some more voiceover recording in the studio as well. But yeah, going back to the main subject. You know what? Here's another good point about podcasting. I don't know how people like it. Try and stay on focus. Yeah, focus. Become one with your podcast. Know the direction you're going, or you end up sounding like me, who will be having a perfectly sensible conversation about podcasting and then talk about the hair that he found in the sink the other day. And I'm bald, so I often wondered how much hair I lose to block a sink. It's crazy. It's probably hers. She's got a lot of hair. Anyway, where was I? Oh yeah, scheduling. Staying on track. Yeah, you can tell with this podcast going, this is how not to podcast. Podcast episode is pretty much probably the benchmark of how not to do it. Because it is just so me. You know what? I don't have a structure when I come on to do these podcasts. So here we go. Look. Scheduling, massively important to new podcasters. I've got to emphasize that because even I get frustrated at myself for not being scheduled. The fact that I struggle so many times to get my scheduling done really annoys me. And I'm part of the Alberta Podcast Network and I need to be more scheduled. These people have adverts that they give me that I need to put out. And I've noticed that some of them are time sensitive and I miss them and it frustrates me. So, rule number 1 to all would-be podcasters or people that are desperate to get into this craft, because I would recommend it. Schedule. Properly schedule. Probably actually don't do what I did. Don't wake up one morning and say, I'm going to do it today. This is it. Woohoo! Get up and record your first episode and then sit there and go, what's the next one going to be about? Oh, blast. Because that's what I do sometimes. I wake up and go, what's my podcast going to be about today? Hence the rambles. But, I have been told, I got a lovely bit of feedback on my last podcast that they really liked this new idea of just let it roll. Don't worry, just let it roll. Any interactions, any disturbances happen, let it roll. I can hear the cats going hells for bells out there. One must be running up and down in front of the door again. I'm not letting them in today. I'm going to try and avoid that. I've got the dog in here. He's sound asleep. Until he starts snoring, we don't have a problem. That's it. So schedule, focus, and maybe get a repertoire of 4 to 6 podcasts in the bank. Make sure you have them ready, because that basically means even if you're doing a weekly podcast, that's 6 weeks covered. That buys you time to start working on more episodes. But here is a key element. Do not do what I do. There are times that I've recorded multiple episodes because I've been late, I've published them, blah, blah, blah. And then what have I done? Yep, you've guessed it. I've sat in my laurels and went, well, I'm okay. I'm up to date, blah, blah, blah. And then, of course, when the new podcast time comes around, I am behind schedule again. So the big concept here is focus, schedule, build up a repertoire, build up a bank of podcasts so that you're not ever falling behind. And it's like what I did last year. I was on the road July and August solidly. I didn't have anything in the bank, so therefore I was done for it. There was 2 months or more that I didn't podcast because I was always away. Now, on hindsight, I need to learn to take some of my basic stuff, my field recording stuff with me, and just do a rough podcast from the road. I'm pretty sure you guys wouldn't mind if it's a wee bit rougher, if it's not as neat, if it's not as acoustically nice as, what I get in this studio. Echo, reverb, all that nonsense. But, it's just make sure you've got that. Make sure you've got that wee bank so that if anything happens, you fall ill, you're on the road, you don't have time, you've always a wee bit ahead of the game. But keep building, keep recording, always get on the mic and keep recording. Point 2 I want to make. Yes, I have now built myself a studio. Oh, there goes my phone. Ha! Okay, I don't know what that was. That was a fun noise it made. I like it when my phone makes fun noises that I don't understand. Any of you guys got a phone that you've had for years and every so often it'll just make a noise that you're like, what was that? Why is my phone doing this? And you're completely bamboozled to why your phone is making this noise because it's never done it before. Well, my phone does this to me a lot. I don't know if it's the imps or gremlins at night coming and changing all my settings, but every so often I'll be like, I will absolutely jump out my skin because of this noise that I've never heard before. And it shouldn't happen because my phone shouldn't be making noises that I don't understand. We've had that conversation. It doesn't listen. Where was I? Focus, yes. Yeah. Well, my name is Callum Lycan. I have a focus issue, yeah. Someone once actually said to me that all performers have a degree of like attention deficit disorder or something like this. There's various terms, so please don't anybody kind of get in touch and have a go at me for this because I'm not up on this. It's maybe something I should read. But certainly one of the things, I was doing an interview once and I was like, I am the ultimate squirrel person. Okay? I'll be interviewing and my head will just be going, woo, I'll be looking everywhere. And she's looking at me going, she knows I'm taking in everything she's saying, but she's just like, she knows that my brain's going 10 to the dozen at the same time. And then you see a squirrel and you want to chase it. I don't know. Is that just me? Just me. Okay. I have completely forgotten where I was. This is great. We talked about building up a bank. I've talked about being on the road. Yeah, okay. I know where I'm going with this. Hey, glad somebody does. Shut up, phone. It's doing it again. It's just making noises at me. I'm just checking that the battery's not dying or like it's not been hacked by someone. No. Okay. Let's try and focus here. Let's take a moment. Now, some of you might actually be thinking, why am I keeping my phone on? But I've been to so many entrepreneur events that actually one of the key things that was said to me was they don't turn their phone off for anything. That could be money. So I'm a great believer. I always like to keep my phone on now. I keep it on as low as I can. I try not to interrupt certain things, but that could be a business calling me and I can pause doing recording my podcast, although I rather prefer not to. Where was I? Focus. Oh yeah, equipment and studio. Right. So I've got this really fancy studio now. It's not quite right. I know there's a few flaws with it, but it's getting there. I want to stress to everyone out there, you don't need this. I do a lot of other recording things. I help out with Storytellers of Canada Radio. I'm trying to do voiceover work. I record stories for CDs in here. So I have built this studio because I need it. I need something just that little bit more solid, hidden away in acoustic for my work. You do not need it. I have seen so many of my friends who do podcasts that are sitting in the biggest, echoiest room that they've got. They've got their mic in front of them, their monitor in front of them, and they're just working away, recording. That's it. You don't need to get fancy. All I would recommend is try and get a decent mic. USB mics are great, but I would always try and get a better mic. Try and upgrade if you can and get an interface. They do make the difference. Yes, it increases the cost, but I use the 2i4 Focusrite Scarlett 2i4 interface and my Rode NT1A mics. So they're about $600 for that package. If you were to buy them, I think it's $300 Canadian for the mic at about 300 or so for the interface, but it makes such a difference, guys. You don't need to quite go as fancy. There are much better and cheaper options out there which will help you for a better budget, a lower budget. But I would highly recommend trying to get yourself an interface, trying to get yourself a good mic. The reason I went for the 2i4 is because it just had a few extra functions and it had the dual channel, which meant I could have two mics in it. That's all I need. I don't need anything more. I've got my Zoom H5 that I originally used for an interface, but I found that it wasn't, I don't know, I always think that Zoom H5 was a bit faulty. Something's wrong with it, and I never got it looked at, which was my own fault, just because I never had the time. But a Zoom H5 basically has 2 ports. You can buy an adapter to create 4 ports on it, so you can actually plug in 4 mics into it. So there's lots of things out there that will do a great job for you. So that's what I do recommend, though. Don't worry about having an acoustic zone. My first sound booth was, those indoor greenhouses that you get, those upright things where you put plants when you're germinating seeds. We had a couple of them, and I just kind of jerry-rigged it all together to make a kind of reasonably sized booth zone. I then went and bought moving blankets. I saw some advice, a couple of sheets and moving blankets, and kind of clipped it all on. And it created a really good acoustic zone. I did have my acoustic shield in there as well, but it did enough to dull the sound and make it work. And I know a lot of voiceover actors to this day use simple setups like that, but you do not need anything fancy. If I can recommend, go on to guys like Booth Junkie on YouTube and look at his repertoire. He talks about how to make a sound booth or a recording booth out of a wardrobe with a mattress if you're traveling. So there's loads and loads of options out there, folks. Lots of stuff you can do. You do not need a proper studio. I mean, mine is not a proper studio, but it's getting there. It's getting to a good standard. As I say, the guys that have come in to record here, they're like blown away by it. I'm happy with that. That's a positive thing. The work I did has made a difference. But you don't need it fancy. Just get out there and do it. Podcast and have fun. Okay? So the second recommendation is make sure you pick up at least a decent mic and a decent interface. It's not necessary, but it will help. And it will save a lot of hassle in the future. You don't need to be acoustically sound. You can do it anywhere you want. Don't worry about it. People are forgiving. But, if you are worried, throw yourself under your bed mattress or your bed blankets in your bed. That's how some folk do it. They just throw their duvet. Do duvets exist in Canada? I don't know. They just throw their duvet over their head and record it like that. So there's loads of these techniques. So this is what I'd recommend for podcasting. Just do it. Just find a way to do it and make it happen. Try to avoid USB mics. They are good, but I would try and avoid them. Pick yourself up a couple of $100 mic. You can do it for USB mic, don't get me wrong. But you'll notice the difference once you start to upgrade. You know what? Forget that statement. just do it with what you've got. And then when you start to make it work and you start to love it more, just keep upgrading. Just have fun. It's the best way to do it. So there is my second recommendation on this How Not to podcast. You see, I started with a Snowball mic and I never used it. I hated the sound of it. I bought it without testing it and I was like, no, I don't like this. And that's why I never podcasted for so long, until eventually I was like, you know what, bite the bullet. You need a decent mic for your work. Let's do it. And I went and bought this Rode NT1A. And at first I wasn't happy with it. It's taken me a wee bit of tweaking because of the Scots and the I've had to do a lot of jerry rigging with pencils and wind guards, etc., just to kind of reduce some of the stuff, because I'm not, I don't know. I mean, I spoke about this last time. You know, I do a lot of public stuff, but mic stuff I'm never sure about. I don't know how I sound, folks. I hate the sound of my voice, so I try not to listen to too much of me. I don't know how you listen to me. I get fed up with the sound of my voice, but people seem to like it. But the reality is, it's like you just get by with what you've got until, if you have enough passion, you start to upgrade. But my recommendation would be try and get an interface and a decent mic to start with. And of course, a pop shield. Always guaranteed. You didn't want to be slavering all over your mic. I don't know, I spit a lot apparently when I talk. Yep, there we go. Scottish thing, apparently, yes. It's a spit and slaver. And you don't want that all over your good mic. Never spit and slaver all over your new mic or drop it in a cup of coffee. Not that I've ever done that in this studio. That's another story. But highly recommend just getting out there and recording. Do it. Buy good equipment. Have fun. So schedule. Have a backlog. Just do it. Don't worry about all the acoustics. You know, you'll learn that. A lot you can play with in your system. I use Audition, but there's Audacity, which is a free one. Used to use it. Didn't quite like it, but you know what? Still a brilliant wee system. If you're on Mac, you've got GarageBand and stuff like that. So there's loads of systems you can use. But my recommendation is just do it. Get a good theme. Have fun. And you know what? Don't care. Rule number 3. Don't care. Why do I say that? Because if you start to worry too much, you're never going to get it done. This is the reality. Okay, so prime example is me. I do so much storytelling stuff and performance stuff, and sometimes it gets to you. Sometimes you start to worry, oh my goodness, is this going to be okay? But I realised with my podcasting when I first started, I mentioned this in the last episode, you know, I got off track and started to kind of try and business professional, blah, blah, blah. And then I realised, you know, I was losing the love for it. So here is the truth of it. Just do it. Make it happen. Have fun and don't care. Talk your mind. Speak what you want to speak. Be who you want to be. Don't be an ass. That's the only rule I've got. Don't go out and deliberately try to offend or be rude or callous or just an idiot. Go out with a good concept. Go out and have fun. Be passionate. But be yourself. And don't care. If you mess up, roll with it. We're only human. We're all here. One life, one time on this weird ball of rock that's fleeing through the universe. We're here. Oh, wait a minute. Is it a ball? I don't know. Or is it flat? Or is it egg-shaped? Or are we riding on the back of a giant turtle? Geez, who knows? Who cares? Bloody idiots. Let's just have fun with this. This is all about having fun, folks. So just be yourself and speak your own mind. That's what I realised very quickly into this. I'm just going to be me and I'm just going to have fun. And if you guys don't listen, meh. That's your problem. That's your loss. I'm here talking. I'm having fun. I'd love to do this on radio. I reckon I'd get crucified on radio. I'd have a mob outside the radio station with burning torches and pitchforks trying to get me. But just have fun and be yourself and speak your mind. And if you get an audience, you get an audience. And if you don't worry about it. Because you're doing something you're passionate about. And it will work. There's many guys out there that work in this philosophy. I spoke about Gary Vaynerchuk. I keep mispronouncing his name. There's one that would definitely crucify me. Can't even pronounce his name. But the reality is, there's a guy that goes out and he just doesn't care. He said that he's passionate. He believes in what he's doing, but he doesn't care what people think. He will just speak his mind and make it happen. And eventually the right people will listen. They'll hear your words, and that's the important thing. Don't worry too much about your specific audience. I keep reading these reports that you focus, you write your perfect audience model, you do all the sales thing, well, my perfect audience is Gary. Gary is a 48-year-old man. He wears blazers and grey v-neck tops with a grey tie and a white shirt. His slacks are charcoal brown, and he wears toeless shoes, sandals more to the point, and socks. Gary is a very interesting person. He works as a florist in, and this is what they ask you to do. They ask you to imagine, a lot of things will ask you to imagine this perfect audience, right? And what if your podcast doesn't have a perfect audience? Okay, folks, what's my perfect audience? Here's a challenge for you. Callum Lycan Studio, send a message. Callum Lycan spoken word at gmail.com. Email me and tell me, what's my perfect audience? Is it kids, adults, older generation? Is it millennials? Who is it? Because as far as I can say, I just do my podcast, and whoever listens and enjoys it is my audience. They might not be my perfect audience. You are my perfect audience. I'm just telling you, just for you guys. But you know what I mean? It's like, it might not be this perfect image that's supposed to be your perfect audience, but who is? I like different things from other people. So you can't pigeonhole me as a perfect audience for something. I occasionally watch soccer. I don't particularly like it. I'll enjoy it. I'll watch various things. I'll listen to various things. That doesn't mean I'm the perfect audience. So here is another little snippet of how not to podcast. The experts will tell you need to create a perfect demographic kind of individual. John Lee Dumas is a big believer in this. The podcast on fire, or whatever he is. Basically, he's just trying to sell his world. It gets a bit annoying when you listen to him. No offense, Johnny. You're doing obviously great. You're making your money. I respect that. What I can't get into is the fact that every time you do something, it's just you pitching yourself. You know what? I don't see any value in that for me as an audience member. But the reality is, it's like, he has this great thing. I did one of his courses. I bought into it and I looked at it and I was like, okay, this is good. I can see what you're saying in certain areas. Just stop trying to sell yourself. I don't want to hear about your business every 2 seconds. But he came up with this idea, and he uses this kind of model where you create your perfect audience member, your perfect listener. And that is how you build your podcast. By this one character profile, that is who you're selling your podcast to. And I'm sorry, no. I get it. I understand. I've done sales, I've done management, I've done business development. I know where it's all coming from. But here's the thing, folks. It's all rubbish at times. People are free thinking. They are imaginative, spontaneous, driven, wonderfully energetic, passionate, love-driven people. We are crazy, full of emotion. We're just like a melting pot of crazy because our emotions take over, our life takes over, the world is there, we're bombarded by everything, and we are just fantastic. We're just this ball of energy and love and passion, and this is what makes humanity. This is what makes people. This is why we do crazy stuff. This is why we get into trouble occasionally. This is why we podcast or throw ourselves on stage or hide in our rooms or play computer games. This is what drives us, the world, ourselves, our DNA, our chemical history, everything. Somebody will explain this so much better than me. The magic that is in us, folks. It's magic. That's what it is. It's like spiders are the souls of tiny little wizards. It's all magic. Okay. It's all fairy dust and magic. Where was I? Here we go. The reality is, because of this whole mix, this melting pot that we are as humans, as people, as individuals, how can we be pigeonholed by one character profile? And I find that insulting, because I'll listen to a podcast and I'll either like it or not. I'll listen to or watch a program. I'll read a book. And you know what? That doesn't make me that character profile. So If you hear this and people tell you need to create this perfect demographic character profile, that may work on some occasions. Like if you're doing a sports show, you know your demographic, but bear in mind it doesn't need to always be that way. Okay, prime example, I've told you I'm not a sportsman, but I love Bill Burr's podcast, his Monday morning podcast. And throughout it, he talks about sports and other subject matters. I love it, but I don't like sports. I know nothing about what he's talking about when it comes to the American football or the teams. I know none of that stuff. But the reality is I enjoy it because of who he is, his personality, the way he does his podcast, his interactions, the stuff he talks about, just his random weirdness and fun. I am not the perfect demographic for his show, but yeah, I enjoy it. If you're doing a sports show, yeah, you're bound to have a perfect demographic or at least a stable demographic. But the reality is you'll still get some random people like me listening in. So my piece of advice is, yeah, have an idea who you're focusing on, what you're wanting to do, but just don't pigeonhole yourself to a demographic. See who listens, put it out there. You never know. You could do a show on knitting. Oh, man, I don't know how that would work. I think it would be delightfully hypnotic, talking while you're knitting, hearing the clink, clink, clink in the background. But here's the thing. You think about knitting, instantly you think about your gran or your mum, the older generation. But how do you know you're not going to get a group of young lads at the university who have started a knitting club because they just think it's cool and they actually don't see the clothes they want in the shops? There's no way to pigeonhole us. Just roll with it. Make your podcast for the people. Do it for yourself. Do it for the people. Have fun. See who listens. That's about the best thing I can say about creating a podcast. Don't worry. Have fun. Don't worry. Be happy. If you like. Yeah, okay. Let's not get me singing. I'm not good at singing. I don't know why I started singing in my podcast, folks. This is not a voice for a song. It's like a train wreck waiting to happen when I start singing. If you want my body and you think I'm sexy. See, I'm all about So I Married an Axe Murderer. Anyway, we've talked about schedule, having a backup. We've talked about a wee bit of equipment, soundproofing, and not to worry too much. We've talked about your demographic. And again, don't worry, just have fun. Look, basically the How to Not Podcast guide that I'm doing here isn't really a How to Not Podcast. What it is, I suppose, is just do it. Just in the words of Shia LaBeouf, do it. Have fun. Get out there. Come up with a concept. Have an idea of what you want to do. If anyone who's interested in podcasting, if you want to get in touch with me, I'm not an expert, guys. Please, God, if you've listened to this podcast, you know I am not an expert. There's no way in this greenish, brownish, whitish planet. The reason I say whitish is because it's covered in snow here. There's no way in this planet that I can ever call myself an expert in podcasting. I'm reasonably expertise in storytelling and other areas of life. Podcasting, I love. It is a bit of my business. I probably could be a lot better at it. I could be a lot more professional at my editing, etc. But you know what? The reality is I like to have fun. This is an aspect of my business. Yes, I do make a bit of money on it, but this is an aspect that I have fun. And there's another interesting point, monetizing your podcast. Please do not go into the podcast industry immediately wanting to make money on it. It's not going to happen. Some of us have got lucky. I got very lucky. I got picked up by the Alberta Podcast Network. Amazing. I'm so happy about that. But don't go in with that expectation. You need to build your podcast huge, massive following before you get that. My following is small. And I appreciate every single one person who listens to this. And it probably is one person. Yeah. Cassie, love you, darling. I know you're my one listener. friend to the family. She's so good. And I appreciate that one demographic listener. And she is not a typical demographic for this podcast. So, this is the thing. One listener maketh the podcast. But yeah, don't go in with the expectation of trying to make money, because it's a really tough industry, and like everyone can do podcasts now. Once upon a time, it's like everything, YouTube, podcasting, all these, blogging, you could start to monetize them quite quickly in the past. Once upon a time, In a country far away, in a world long ago, you could make money on YouTube, podcasting, and blogging because no one else did it. These days, not so much. Harder. You've got to be more unique. You've got to offer something cool. That's why I'm not worried about my podcast. I do my thing. I know it's never going to make much money. I don't care. I'm having fun. If somebody wants to pick me up and start sponsoring me more because I sound gorgeous, I'm handsome, charming, I'm Scottish, I'm just a delight to be around, then please feel free to pay me lots of money. I'd be happy. I'll podcast full time. I'll radio full time. Hey, guys, come and speak to me. You know, have kilt. We'll do anything. No, no, scratch that last statement, folks. That is not quite what I meant. Anyway, don't go into podcasting with the idea of monetizing because it's not going to happen straight away. You might be able to monetize, you might get some sponsorship, but my best advice would be maybe look for a network that will take you on, because that way you do fulfill the sponsors and you get a small monetary amount for each sponsorship. And that, it's not great. It's not going to make you a millionaire. It's not even going to make you a thousandaire. But the fact is, it will cover your podcast sites like Libsyn or Podbean. It will start to cover, shut up phone, it will start to cover some of the equipment costs over time, and basically it will just help you break even a wee bit. So that's the best thing to do. Then if you get better and bigger and more people show interest, you can then decide how you want to go. But, you know, join a network if there's one about, or even build your own. You probably know podcasts. If you're going into podcasting, you'll know podcasters. The chances are there's a podcast meetup or network in your area. So go and speak to them and maybe try and join something. And as a unit, you can approach businesses. Those businesses might be happy for you to advertise for them and they'll pay you. So there you go. But don't go into it. I know a lot of podcasts out there that don't make money and they do not care. They're here to have fun. Have fun first and foremost, and potentially the money will come later. And there you go, folks. That is the golden rule of podcasting. So, the how to not to podcast. I don't know where this has gone, actually. Have I fulfilled my remit on this podcast, or am I just doing what I always do, going round the houses? This is why I love doing what I do. I'm going round the houses again. My phone keeps going. I hope there's some business in here. Because it'd be really nice. Here's an interesting thing that I've noticed, right? Anyone who knows the Meetup app, I don't know if you guys have got that, you know, and basically the Meetup app, it's not a dating thing, it's a business thing quite often. So I go to ATB entrepreneur events on it. I do entrepreneur events all over. I go to a podcast meetup group, etc. We chat, we have a beer, we talk about equipment. I don't know what's happening the last couple of days. A lot of porn sites or something seem to have hacked it. And I keep getting these updates. Oh, such and such commented on this page. And when you go to look at it, instantly you can see the little image. The photo of the profile is like, for sexy vids, click this link. And it's like, oh, for God's sake, is nothing sacred. I'm never going to click those links, folks. I'm sorry. Not my bag. Mainly because I don't want to get a virus. I'm not going to deny that the concept of what they're touting is maybe not appealing in certain things, but the fact is I don't want to get viruses because we all know it's just a hacking thing. Yeah, Mum, don't listen to this podcast. I just think I admitted I watched porn in the past. Okay, scratch that, please, folks. Scratch that. Nobody heard anything. I am a God-fearing, happy, loyal, innocent storyteller from Scotland. My kilt has never blown up in the wind. I have never experienced kissing a girl or anything. Yes, I'm an innocent. I'm pure. That's probably the biggest amount of comments I'll ever get in my podcast from those statements, and most of them will come from Scotland with scoffs and abuse. So, folks, the how to not to podcast, you know, my advice is do podcast, have fun, you know, build up a backlog. Pick up a couple of decent bits of equipment. It makes life easier. Use a decent editor. Learn that editor. One of the things that they always say is your editing software, learn it in and out. Don't have cats that meow at your studio door because somebody is now meowing at the door. I could probably wager it's Una. Una is going to become a regular on this podcast. She loves coming to the door when I'm podcasting because she hates that closed door. Hamish, he's still sound asleep. He's pretty cool. He's out for the count. So yeah, backlog. Decent equipment. Decent equipment. Learn your software. Really kind of get used to it. Don't over-process either. There's I'll give you a little bit of. I'm grabbing a bit of paper here, folks. You'll probably hear the rustling. But I use very simple processes. I do a bit of noise reduction, usually at 72% and 50.3 dB. I do a little bit of I think it's normalized wavy. No, not normalized. Wave 5 band equalizer. Very basic, and then I normalize it to 3 dB, and that's pretty much my processing unless there's a real problem. And of course I remove the big peaks, try and balance out the sound out and remove any major hiccups. But yeah, just learn your software, understand what you're doing, and have fun. Don't worry about that demographic. Just create a podcast for you and the world. Okay, you don't want to just create it for yourself, because that's not going to work. But create something that you think the world wants to hear. If you want your voice to be heard, have fun doing it. Get out there and don't worry about that demographic. If it's a niche podcast, yes, there will be a little bit more of a demographic in there. But hey, look at me. I'm doing storytelling. Storytelling should be for kids or old folks, apparently. I don't believe I do corporate storytelling. I do storytelling at Burns events. I do storytelling for everything. My world is, I believe storytelling is everything. Take that philosophy. Just believe, even if you're doing a podcast on board games, Dungeons and Dragons, introduce the damn world to Dungeons and Dragons, folks. Introduce them to board games. Introduce them to whatever you're passionate about. If it is knitting, show the world how cool knitting can be. Well, don't show them. Let them hear how cool knitting can be. But the reality is, just do it. And I can guarantee you'll get a listener or listeners or an audience. Or the world, but just have fun creating your podcast. Backlog. Equipment. Learn your software. Don't worry about your audience profile. And most of all, just have fun. Make your podcast yours. Now, with that in mind, we should probably move on. I think I've rambled enough. I always do. But you know what? It's fun. I have fun. As I said, who's my demographic? I don't know. Hopefully you guys are listening. But let's move on with the Bothy Storytelling Podcast. Okay, so let's get on with our book recommendation for this episode of the Bothy Storytelling Podcast. Now, I've been talking about podcast, how to podcast, which way you want to take this one. So there's a couple of books that I actually picked up when I was looking at podcasting, just to get a kind of bit more background. The first one, not oddly enough, I've kind of made comment about this guy, John Lee Dumas. He did Podcast Launch, a step-by-step guide of how to launch your podcast. Now, it is an okay book. I'm not going to fully recommend it. If you can get it on like Kindle for $1 or so, go for it. But it really is a lot of self-promotion in it. And to be honest, I didn't find it as useful as I was hoping. So I ended up picking up another book. And it was, let me just, and here's a musical interlude while I try and load up this book. Just need to, dear. Yeah, technology, folks. Should have had this ready for you. Should have had this ready. I'm clicking back, going like crazy, yes, here we go. The book that I think would be slightly more useful for you, and I'm not going to say greatly useful, because the problem with a lot of the podcasting books is they don't quite give you everything that you're looking for, but this one gave me enough. It's How to Podcast Volume 4.0. It's by Paul Colligan. 4 simple steps to broadcast your message to the entire connected planet, even if you don't really know what podcasting is. Now, Paul Colligan is the CEO of the Podcast Partnership, host of the Podcast Report, author of the Amazon #1 bestseller Multicast Marketing, How to Podcast 2016, YouTube Strategies 2016, and How to Stream Video Live 2016. See, he's got a reasonable pedigree. And it is How to Podcast Volume 4.0. As I say, decent book. There's still some bits in it that are self-promotion. This is the whole thing. You have to read through a little bit about them. It's the usual standard thing. But you've got what is podcasting, create digital media, put it online, make it podcast ready, tell the world, and a lot of bonus stuff in there. So I would highly recommend, if you're looking for a book, just to give you a bit more background on podcasting, if this medium appeals to you, How to Podcast, Volume 4.0 by Paul Colligan. It's worth a read. Again, I picked it up on Kindle. When I'm buying these sort of books, I generally buy them on Kindle and not paperback. So they are going to cost you a little bit less. I think this was about $4 for me. So well worth it. If you're on a budget, trying to find a couple of books on podcasting, have a look at them. Look at the John Lee Dumas one as well. As I say, don't buy it if it's more than a couple of dollars, because it is a lot of self-promotion. There's information in there. It's useful. But eventually, if you're like me, it starts to irk on you just how many times he mentions something, whatever it is, on fire, blah, 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 blah. So I would recommend How to Podcast, Volume 4.0 by Paul Colligan is one to start with. Not 100% go buy it podcast recommendation, but it's certainly one that I've read, so I would look at it and see what you think. So that is our Bothy Storytelling Podcast book recommendation for this episode. And with that, we'll move on to our podcast recommendation. As you know, we are sponsored by the Alberta Podcast Network, sponsored itself by ATB. And the podcast I'm going to choose from the network today is one which I suppose, we talked about that perfect audience. We talked about that kind of, demographic. And here's a podcast which to me could be open to many things because, he's looking at more of a kind of niche subject, but at the same time, it'll be open to lots of people because it's something that potentially a lot of young and old have been through or are going to go through. And it's the Undad Podcast. The Undad Podcast, a podcast about family and how you are formed by your environment, courtesy of Trent Wilkie, a writer, performer, and father of two. So that is the Undad Podcast by Trent Wilkie, a podcast about family and how you are formed by your environment. He's a writer, a performer, and a father of two. Now, to me, that sounds fantastic and fascinating. Haven't had a chance to listen to Trent. I'm not going to lie to you folks, so I'm giving this as a bit more of a blind recommendation, but it falls in line with that kind of niche concept because a lot of people would be like, oh, that's all about family. That's all about, a dad raising his kids and all that. No. That to me is a fantastic concept because it's actually going into how the environment affects us, which is such a true thing. And it's a huge element of storytelling as well because stories all come from the environment. So Trent is doing this wonderful podcast, the Undad Podcast. It's on the Alberta Podcast Network, sponsored by ATB. And I would highly recommend that as a podcast to listen to. If you're new podcasting and you want to get a grasp of how different people are doing it, for one, if you enjoy family-style podcasts, or if you just want to get a kind of grasp of what I mean when I say, don't worry about that demographic, just do a podcast. Because this would be specific to a demographic. Some people would say, I disagree. I'm going to have a listen to it. I'm going to see what Trent's on about, and I reckon I'll enjoy it simply because it's going to be unusual, it's going to be fun, and it's going to be quite an intriguing perspective that he's taking on things. So, the Undad Podcast, Trent Wilkie, part of the Alberta Podcast Network, and that is your recommendation for this episode of the Bothy Storytelling Podcast. And with that, we come to the end of an episode of the Bothy Storytelling Podcast. This has been the episode about how not to podcast, which I don't know if I actually covered properly, because maybe I promoted podcasting better, but it doesn't matter. Give it a go, see how it works, just try and remember some of these wee things that I've learned over the years to come, and we'll see what happens with you guys. And please get in touch at Callum Lycan Studio or Callum Lycan spokenword@gmail.com. Please drop me a line and get in touch. And remember, guys, we are up for a nomination on the Canadian Podcast Awards. We have 2 nominations, one in the arts, which only podcasters can vote for, and the other one, which is more important to me, is the People's Choice. So please head over to Canadian Podcast Awards. Click on the People's Choice, look for the Bothy Storytelling Podcast with my little cartoon character. Click on it and vote for me for People's Choice because I would really like that. The reality is, I don't win anything. Discussed this last time. People's choice is more important than other podcasters voting for me. It's lovely to get recognition from peers, but it's more important if you guys are enjoying the show. Please vote for it. Help me win the Canadian Podcast Awards for People's Choice, and I will eternally be grateful. I will cheer from the rooftops. I'll wear my kilt every day. I will tell you stories. I will create more CDs for you. I'll do it all. But ladies and gents, I hope you've enjoyed this episode. I'll look forward to seeing you, hearing from you all, and talking to you all on the next episode of the Bothy Storytelling Podcast.